Today we'll be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of New York. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of this filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. This first chart shows total filings by year since 1990 in the state. And during that time, there have been 1.45 million cases filed in New York. In the early 1990s, filings were running right around 50,000 per year. From 1997 to 2004, filings were in the 60 to 80,000 range per year. 2005, which is the year of bankruptcy reform, there was a huge spike in filings, and that was a peak here at nearly 110,000. Filings were off by more than 70% the next year, rebounded somewhat up through 2009 with the Great Recession. Although you can see that in this most recent peak, they were still well below where they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. And then since then, filings are down about 45%. So right now, filings in the state are below where they were back even in 1990, and they're less than half of where they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. This chart shows filings relative to population over the period 1990 to 2015. And New York has been 29% below average, which is 14th lowest among the states. And all the yellow-colored states have very low bankruptcy rates, particularly states in the Northeast. And the very lowest is actually in Alaska. The red-colored states have the very highest bankruptcy rates, and that's mainly throughout the Southeast. And Tennessee is the perennial leader in bankruptcies relative to population. And with New York, even though they're third in population, or they're fourth now, but over the last, since 1990, the average population has been third among the states. They're only seventh in total bankruptcy filings. Looking at it year by year, you can see that in the 1990s, filings were about 23% below average, and the gap has gotten wider over time from the blue, which is the New York bankruptcy rate, compared to the national average on the red columns. And so since, say, 2009, the bankruptcy filing rate in New York has been about 42% below the national average. This chart shows total Chapter 7 cases filed per year, and this pretty much follows, looks very much like the total filings chart. Early 1990s, around 40,000 cases per year. From 1997 to 2004, 50 to 60,000. Big run up in 2005, followed by nearly 80% drop the next year. Then up through the recession, and then back down by about half in recent years. So right now, filings are about half of where they were, or less than half of what they were prior to bankruptcy reform, and actually well below where they were even in 1990, where most states have increased in that time, but New York is down. This chart shows Chapter 11 filings in New York over time, and Chapter 11 cases comprise about 2.5% of all cases filed in New York, which is a lot more than most states, more than everywhere except Delaware. That's due to the activity in the Southern District. And you can see that filings dropped throughout the 1990s, and which was very typical pattern. And then you've had some real up and downs, but it maybe is easier if we break this up into district. And so if we look at the Southern District in New York, where nearly most of the really large cases in the country are filed, the filing patterns per year it has been up and down, but even this gets very skewed by related filings. So, for example, in 2004, the Footstar case had 2,500 related cases out of the 2,900 total filed in the state that year. So actually a quarter of all Chapter 11s filed in the country in 2004 were related filings just in the Footstar case. And there have been a number of other cases that have had, in the hundreds of related cases that kind of skew filings over time. If you look at excluding the Southern District and just look at the Northern, Eastern, and Western District, you see a much more typical pattern, a smoother pattern, with the declines through the 1990s, fairly flat in recent years, at around 200 per year, with maybe a little bit more during and after recessions. This chart shows Chapter 13 cases filed in New York, and starting at about 6,000 in 1990, you had a big run up every year through 1998 to where filings more than doubled, and had periods. The peak year was actually 2003, and at nearly 15,000. A drop off after bankruptcy reform, but not as much as Chapter 7s went down. Then a big increase in 2007, and then this period is kind of interesting because nearly every state had pretty large increases in Chapter 13s from 2007 to 2010. So a typical pattern would have been like that, but New York actually went down. A big drop off in 2011, and filings have been in the 6,000-7,000 range the last 4 or 5 years, which is about where they were back in 1990. Looking at the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13s, and the national average has been right around 30% for a number of decades, with some disruption before and after bankruptcy reform. In New York, it's been more followed the same pattern, but much closer to the 20% range. So we're nationwide about 30% of cases have been Chapter 13s. In New York, it's typically around 20%. District by district in the state, if we take 2015, both the northern, eastern, and southern districts were all right around 21%, and Western District a little bit higher at 28%. This chart shows the unemployment rate in New York by quarter since 2006 compared to the national average. New York is the blue line, and red is the national. And you can see that New York has followed very close to the national average during almost this whole time, except at the height of the recession. The bankruptcy rate the unemployment rate didn't get above 9% in New York, where nationwide it got up to nearly 10%. But now they're both down, come down pretty well, and both New York and the national are at 5% or below right now. The filings peaked nationwide most recently in September 2010, and since then are down by 49%. The biggest declines have been in most of New England and in the Southwest, and particularly California and Nevada. Filings are down by at least 70% since 2010. New York is very close to the national average at 48% decline. A little less in the Southern District and a little bit more in the Western District, but not too much of a pattern throughout the state. The smallest declines have been generally in the Southeast, where most of the states in the Southeast are in the 30 to 40% decline, but New York is right about average. Looking at the decline quarter by quarter, over the years, you can see that in New York, the biggest declines were generally around 2011, 2013. In recent years, both national and New York, the rate of decline has been getting smaller. It's a little bit of an unclear pattern what's going on right now, but nationwide filings in the first 6 months were down 5.9%, and less than less than 1% in New York. And actually, the northern western districts were down, where the eastern and southern districts were up. Third quarter filings were down about 3%. So I think what this shows is that there'll be about 30,000 cases filed this year in New York. Slight increases in the coming years. I don't see any return to the 60 to 80,000 cases that were filed per year from, say, 1997 to 2004, unless another recession hits or some sort of major bankruptcy legislation is enacted. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in the state of New York. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.